Well, when I'm actually doing my own things and I'm working in the high, the deep and esoteric stuff that I worry about, I don't think I can describe very well what it's like. First of all, it's like asking a centipede which leg comes after which. It happens quickly, and I'm not exactly sure what flashes and stuff go in the head. But I know it's a crazy mixture of partially equations, partial solving the equation, then having some sort of picture of what's happening that the equation is saying is happening, but they're not that well separated as the words I'm using. And it's a kind of a nutty thing. It's very hard to describe, and I don't know that it does any good to describe it. And that's something that struck me that's very curious. I suspect that what goes on in every man's head might be very, very different. The actual imagery or semi-imagery which comes. And that when we're talking to each other at these high and complicated levels, and we think we're speaking very well, and we're communicating, but what we're really doing is having some kind of big translation scheme going on for translating what this fellow says into our images, which are very different. But you got to stop and think about it to really get the pleasure about the complexity, the inconceivable nature of nature.
If you watched the previous episodes in this series, you may recall that I started to try to draw pictures of what Haley said she was thinking. Firstly, in one of her early live Go games, and later in her AGA demo game with Nick Sabicki. Both of those situations were complicated. In the former case, it was early in the game, and she was relying heavily on rote-remembered Joseki patterns, which she read out to me and I copied into the game record. It was interesting that at one point she started off feeling unable to explain why she had chosen A over B.
White has two choices, A and B.
You chose A.
It wasn't because A was better than B. It was more of the choice of style, I guess. So I thought the A or B, either one would be okay. And then when I was playing this game, I just somehow felt like playing A.
But later in our conversation, it came out that she had subconsciously been wanting to complicate the position.
No, because B is also giving better shape to black on the roll side. So when white plays B, maybe it will make it easier. Black and white both have good shape. The black's lower side is pretty much territory, and it will be very difficult for white to invade in it.
Yes, I know. I think so too.
Yes.
In her game with Nick, where she had executed a coup that left him shell-shocked, she pointed to a couple of weak points in Nick's shapes and, according to Nick's counts, had spent 3 or 4 minutes thinking about them. However, I think that probably most of that time was spent chatting with the audience. Both of those games were played at a high level, much further up the mountain than Shodan. So in episode 10, I asked Haley and everyone about a much simpler situation. At least, I thought it was simple. However, only 2 people, G and B, were brave enough to volunteer their thoughts, and they each saw different things in it.
Whereas for me, it was the other way, and that's where I discovered, at least in this very simple operation of counting, the great difference in what goes on in the head when people think they're doing the same thing. And so it struck me, therefore, if that's already true at the most elementary level, that when we learn the mathematics and the Bessel functions and the exponentials and the electric fields and all these things, that the imageries and method by which we're storing it all and the way we think about it could be really, if we could get into each other's heads, entirely different. And in fact, why somebody sometimes has a great deal of difficulty understanding a point which you see as obvious, and vice versa. It may be because it's a little hard to translate what you just said into his particular framework and so on. Now I'm talking like a psychologist, and you know I know nothing about this.
G and B are both 5-dan players, even stronger than Nick, so we can learn a lot from them before looking at what Haley had to say about the position. The meaning that flashes up to their consciousness when they blink. The meaning that Daniel Kahneman calls fast thinking.
See, and many times in science, by using imagination, you've imagined something which could be, according to all the known knowledge of the laws, and you don't know whether it is yet or not. And that's very interesting. There's a creative imagination, you like to call it, not just imagining things that are relatively easy, but something different.
So let's start with what G said.
The shape in the corner and right one page number shape inside black eye page are the focal points.
This brief statement, made at the surface of the sea of G's mind, is a sequence of words. If IBM's Watson computer were told it, Watson would rush off to the library and Google through thousands of books looking for single-word matches and simple surface structure fragments of the form the focal point is the shape, in the hope that one of the sentence fragments it finds in there will contain the answer the Jeopardy game wants. Watson would turn up lots of stories about the shapes of women, as these are very common in the popular press. So based on its heuristic device that the more common something is, the more likely it is to be the right answer, it would buzz and say, "What is cleavage?" Watson is arguably some kind of AI, but not a very knowledgeable one. Noam Chomsky calls it a bigger steamroller. Bigger than Big Blue, that is. I think Chomsky hit the nail right on the head, as he usually does. But even so, I think there's a fair chance the Watson-like Go-playing program would do quite well. But that's another story I'll leave aside for a future episode. Words have no meaning to Watson. They're just strings of squiggles it looks for in its library. But they are redolent with a forest of meaning for people. Shape is a word that has a special meaning in Go. People talk about such things as good shape, bad shape, light shape, and heavy shape. This is something Hallie needs to know about. But shape of what?
I'm not answering your question, but I'm telling you how difficult a why question is. You have to know what it is that you're permitted to understand and allowed to be understood and known, and what it is you're not. You'll notice in this example that the more I ask why, it gets interesting after all. That's my idea, that the deeper a thing is, the more interesting it is. Contains this tremendous information, and it's all really there. That's what gets you. You asked me if an ordinary person, by studying hard, would get to be able to imagine these things like I imagined. Of course, I was an ordinary person who studied hard. There's no miracle people. It just happens they got interested in this thing, and they learned all this stuff. They're just people. There's no talent, a special miracle ability to understand quantum mechanics, or a miracle ability to imagine electromagnetic fields that comes without practice and reading and learning and study. So if you say you take an ordinary person who's willing to devote a great deal of time and study and work and thinking and mathematics and time, then he's become a scientist. So the question is whether you could get to know what things do without better than we do today. As the generations develop, will they invent ways of teaching and ways so that the new people will learn tricky ways of looking at things and be so trained, so well trained, that they won't have our troubles.
This is one of the important things about images. Mental images are structures